This is the fifth and final video in my five-part development series for Hyperledger Composer. In this video, I will be taking you from start to finish, creating a sample Composer application. Now, in the last four videos, we've talked about the individual parts of a Composer application, which includes the modeling language, the permissioning language, as well as the JavaScript API that allows you to write the smart contracts, the logic behind the network. So in this video, I hope to just tie all of those together. Also, I will note that the dev team for Hyperledger Composer has just released a new version, so 0.15, and I will be working with this version in this video. So please note that if you've been following along to the last four videos, that you will have to update several things in your environment. Also, Node has changed their long-term support version, so you'll have to update that as well. But don't worry, I'll be taking you through that, reminding you how to do that if you had forgotten. Also, there is going to be a GitHub repo where I will have all of the relevant commands from this video listed in the README, and all of the code that I was working with in the repo as well. So I will list that in the video description for you to use along with this video. So let's dig into this new release. You can see that the features that have been added are primarily revolve around business network cards and wallets to manage the different identities in the business network. So we actually have a little bit of familiarity of this already because we've been using the Composer Playground, switching back and forth between the playground and the actual code. And so we kind of understand this already. If you go up to admin and click ID registry, you can see that this whole idea of wallets and identity cards has already been implemented in the Composer Playground. All the new release has done is integrate it, integrate this interface that Playground has to the command line interface that we are also using. So it's actually kind of nice. We just we don't have to write these long lines of code anymore. So if you remember something like this, if we wanted to ping our network, we had to put in a flag that specified the connection profile, the network, and then we had to type in our credentials here to verify our identity. We no longer have to do this. It's a much shorter command, and I'll be taking you through that. So it's kind of nice. Also, we have previously been looking at the Composer API through the original JS doc. And you can see the modules up here, the admin, client, common, and runtime. I will no longer be using this to refer to, as the API reference has been updated a little bit. It's nicer to use. So if you come to the official Composer documentation, go down to API reference and click the class index, you can see that here are the four modules that we have been working with, and all of the classes that are contained within each of the modules here. So kind of nice here. Overall, I think the changes are pretty good. I know that there's probably a few bugs out there at this point since it's only 1 day old at this point. So bear with me here. I'll do the best I can to take you through this new release, and also hopefully everything works out well. The first thing that we need to do is update our environment. So as I've put in the video description, this is a Mac tutorial, so I'm not covering Linux or Windows commands here. But the first thing that you need to do is nvm install the long-term support version of Node, because Node has actually updated this long-term support version, and the new Composer release relies on it. So you'll just come over to the terminal, nvm install LTS, and you can see I've already got 8.9.1 installed. After you've done that, you can come down and install all of the Composer tools. So you can see here I've said npm install global all the tools, but if you've been following along with this video before, you just do npm update g composer client and that should do it. So run those 4 commands again because I know they've been updated. You will also want to kill off all of your running Docker containers if you know, have been using maybe the playground locally, or simply you've followed along with the last couple videos and still have some containers running. So these 4 commands here you can run. And once again, this is going to be in a much nicer format on the GitHub repo. I just have not pushed it up at this point. So you can find that in the video description. Next, if if you've been working with version 0.14, you know that when we create the composer credentials and connection profiles, they will go to these directories here under the home directory, .composer connection profiles and composer credentials. I'll just go ahead and have you delete those because we don't need those any longer, and it only can confuse. So once you have done all of that, those are all kind of just precursors. We need to download the new Fabric tools because they have also been updated a little bit. So you can run this command here. Once again, go to the GitHub repo and find the README to copy paste them. Once you have downloaded the Fabric tools, you'll need to go into cd into the Fabric tool directory, and you'll run these 3 commands here. Download Fabric, start Fabric, and create peer admin card. You'll notice that this last command, the create peer admin card, is a little bit different from previously because what we would do is start the Fabric and create a composer connection profile, and so now we're just creating a peer admin card. But if we run that, we should be able to start up the Fabric and be ready to work with our network. So I've done that already. So we'll go to the terminal, and now what we're going to do is create a template application. So you can see down here we can generate a template with yo. So we'll run this command, and I believe I've got everything updated, but we'll go ahead and see. So you run that command, and then it's going to ask you what your network name is. I'll just put perishable network to stay consistent with the last 4 videos. And the author name is Zach at Apache license. And also to stay consistent, you can see I've already got it in as the default, but I'll rewrite it. We're keeping the same namespace that we have previously. You can see there that what we have created is a new directory called perishable network. So we can actually, I'm going to copy the README into the perishable network, and we'll go back to VS Code. You know what, let's just open a brand new window here. And we're going to go to the desktop and open the new perishable network directory. And now you can see that we have the files necessary to create our network. So we have a logic.js that we can use to create the logic behind our network. We have the model file, which you can see is actually updated to a different name now, but it's the same stuff. We'll be updating the contents of this to what we've been working with previously. And then you have the package.json, which has actually changed quite a bit. A lot more simplified, but once again, we'll be talking about this as we go. Before I get too much into the code itself, I wanted to go through a little bit of the architecture behind Composer because I know in the last couple videos I really haven't done that. So let's go over to the command line. And if you remember, well, actually, first let's get started. So um, I know I told you to do this just a second ago, but I'll go ahead and start the fabric. I need to go to Desktop, Fabric Tools, and then you see that I have all these scripts that I can run, and one of them is Start Fabric. Now, I'll also note that these top level scripts are actually calling on this right here. There's a directory called Fabric Scripts within Fabric Tools, and if you go to these, then you can see that you have different scripts for different connection profiles, and when you run this Start Fabric under Fabric Tools, it's going to assume that you're using this connection profile. And within this connection profile, it's going to automatically run these scripts here. So Start Fabric, Stop Fabric, Tear Down Fabric, all of your standard commands. But this is taken care of for us, so we will CD back out to Fabric Tools. You can see that we're in Fabric Tools. We're going to, first, if you haven't done so already, you download the fabric. I've already done so, and you can see that if you run docker ps, actually docker images. If you run docker images, you can see that you've got all of the images by downloading the fabric. Now we want to start the fabric. And once we have started the fabric successfully, we can see that if we run docker ps, this will show us that we're running containers for all of those images that the download fabric script had created. So those are running in the background right now. And finally, if you see, we have a script called create peer admin card. So if you're using, right now, we are using the Composer version 0.15, but if that was 0.14, if you're still using the old one, what you would be running is the create composer profile. And what that's going to do is create some a connection profile and credentials in those directories that I talked about, the home directory, composer, credentials, so on and so forth. But what we want to do, since we're in version 0.15, is create peer admin card. So we'll run that. And you can see that we now have a peer admin card, and it's listed out right here. Another way that we can do this, listed out, is just by typing composer card list. And it's going to show us the following business network cards are available. Now, if you want to get a little bit deeper into it, I'll show you the directory that it's creating it in. So right now, we are in the home directory, desktop, and then Fabric Tools, which is where I put my Fabric Tools directory. Now, if we go to our home directory, .composer, and CD into that, you can see that we have two directories called cards and client data. We can CD into cards, and you can see this peer admin that we had listed up here. And I believe that is, I do not believe that's a directory. Oh, that is a directory. So yeah, so here we have the connection.json. I'll print that out here, which, right, this is exactly what we had in the Composer connection profile in the last version. So right now, let's CD back out, and you can go ahead and play around looking in these two directories just to see all the different data. But essentially, these directories, is the whole identity management thing that I've been talking about and that has been updated quite a lot since the last version. So at this point, you would essentially be writing out your entire business network, starting with the template that the Yo generator made for us. For the sake of this tutorial, since we've already done a lot of, actually writing code in the previous videos, I'm just going to copy what we had into this network here. So you can see that if we open up the lib and then logic.js file, I've copied in the smart contract functionality that we wrote in the last video. And then if we come to the models file, I've updated our model file to represent what we wrote in, I believe, video 2. And then also I created a permissions.acl file. Now, it does not come with this file because if you leave it out, if you don't include a permissions.acl file, then the network is completely permissionless and it runs just fine. But we did write a permissions file, so I created that and then copied in what we had written. Lastly, I went to, as you'll see on the README in the GitHub repo, I went to the composer sample networks and found the one that we're working with and found the test file and copied that over here, which you can see it's also called logic.js, but under the test directory. And this should test our network to make sure it's working correctly. Now, there are a few changes that we have to make since we are working with a new release of Composer. I'll start with the package.json file. It does not come, the Yo generator does not specify what engine we're using, so we need to copy this up here to identify that we're using the latest Composer version. Also, if you come down to the scripts section, the Yo generator comes with this command here, the test, and it says Mocha recursive, but we're going to put in a timeout of 0 so that we're not getting errors there. And then also, I put in a couple more scripts, the pretest and the lint test, which will check the syntax of our code, make sure it's the standards, it meets all the syntax standards and passes those tests. So that's actually built in with the Yo generator, the ESLint, and you can see if you come over to the eslintrc.yml file, it automatically defines, all the syntax rules and stuff like that for you when you run, this pretest and lint test. Now there is one thing that we need to add since the default JavaScript version is going to be 5. If we don't put this, we need to come under parser options and specify that we want the 6th version of ECMAScript. So that will cause some errors because in our logic.js file, or if we come to the test file, you can see that we're using the constant, which is not allowed in the 5th version of JavaScript. So you need to do that. Additionally, in this file, from the last version, the Composer client had a little bit different way that it worked with connecting to the admin connection. So previously what we had was we would say return admin connection.connect and then specify our default profile and such. But in the most recent release, the API specifies that we need to use this method, this new method called connect with details. So you'll need to replace all the .connect methods with .connect with details. I believe there's only like 4 of them in here. There's one there. But anyways, that's going to be a breaking change since that's a new method. And I believe I covered everything at this point, all the changes that you need to make. Actually, one more thing, you need to add this package, which will be used in our test file. This is just a way to fake a clock, and since our perishable network, since the payouts depend on if the shipment has arrived on time or late, we need something to simulate a clock, since the test does not actually connect to the real Hyperledger fabric and has those timestamps. Okay, so I think we're good here. I've covered everything that we need to update, so we'll come over to the terminal and say npm install. So once we have installed all the node modules, we can go back and you can see that we don't have a dist directory with our .bna file, which is essentially what we're going to deploy to the Hyperledger fabric. And it's basically a binary that specifies all the code that we wrote in this directory. So we need to come over here and make that directory dist. And then what we need to do is create the archive file. But first, let's type in the flag help to see the new syntax for the composer archive create command. In version 0.15, we can see that all we have to specify now is a source type and a source name to create this. So we'll say composer archive create, and we'll give it source type, or you could do -t. So source type, and we're going to identify that we're creating this BNA file from an entire directory rather than a module. Then we're going to say source name, and we have to specify which directory we're creating it from, which, since we're in perishable network, the top level of the directory, we'll just put a dot for current directory. And then finally, you don't have to put this, but I'm going to define the name for our archive file. Because we created a dist directory, we'll put it in that, and we'll call it perishable network.bna. You can see that this command succeeded, and we can come back over here, and in the dist directory we have the .bna file, which you could subsequently take to the Composer playground and import and run this network. Before we head to the next step of actually deploying this BNA file or business network, let's go ahead and look back at this test file. So we're using the Chai framework to write these unit tests, and you can see that we've done a lot of setup here where we're defining our admin connection, our business network connection and definition. This is all the stuff that we talked about in the previous video with the JavaScript API, and I will ask that you go on your own and kind of read through that documentation in order to create tests for your business network. For the sake of this video and for the sake of time, I won't be walking entirely through this, but just wanted to take you on a quick tour. We are testing basically what we did in the Composer playground, just seeing, is the price, the base price for the shipment, what it should be given that it's in the right temperature range and it's on time, and what the price is for a late shipment, what the price is when we have a minimum temperature violation and then a maximum temperature violation. And just to point this out, since I had mentioned it earlier, the Synon or Synon package is being used here. We're saying that before each test, we are creating a clock, and then after each test, we're restoring that clock. So that way we can make these tests where, should receive nothing for a late shipment. You can see that we're using the clock.tick, whatever this number is. I can't count that many zeros, but that's probably the day, a day's worth of time that has passed by, which is the target for our shipments. So that's why that's there. You can see we initialized it up at the top. But anyways, I don't want to get too deep into this file. I just want to show you how to use it. So come over here and we're at the top level of the directory and we'll say npm test. This is going to take it through the ESLint test to make sure all of the code, we don't have any extra white space, any syntactical errors, and then it's going to go into the chai test that we just talked about. And you can see that we have 4 passing tests, as you would expect with a sample network that we basically copy-pasted into our directory. So you can see that they all passed, and it's now time to actually deploy this business network. And the way that we do that is a lot different from previously before, because now we're using these admin cards, cards for identities, rather than just typing in a bunch of different pieces of information. It makes it easier, but it's a little bit different. So the first thing we have to do is actually install the runtime for Composer. So we'll say Composer runtime install, and let's first take just a quick look at that. You can see that we need to specify a card name to use to install the network and the business network name that we're going to be deploying, or that we're going to be running it on. So these are the 2 that are required. You see at the end it says required. So Composer runtime install, we'll say that the card is the peer admin at HLF v1. That's what I showed you a little bit earlier. Then we'll say the business network name is perishable network. That's defined in the .json file. And we'll go ahead and execute that. Okay, so we successfully installed the runtime, and now what we do is actually deploy this BNA file that we just created, or the archive file, to the runtime. Before deploying, let's just take one more look at the identity cards that we have. So let's split the screen here. Actually, split it vertically. So let's cd in this bottom portion of our terminal. We'll cd into the composer, the .composer directory. You can see that we have the cards directory, so we'll cd into that. And right now we just have the pure admin HLF v1 card. So we'll keep that in mind, and then we'll come back up here, and instead of composer network deploy like we did in the last couple videos, the dev tutorial is actually telling us to do composer network start, and we'll get some help with that. Let's shrink this screen, and you can see we have several options here, some of them being required. So we'll say composer network start, and we need to specify the card, which is C. We'll say the card is peer admin at HLF v1, as we see down here under the cards directory. Then we will say our network admin right here, which is required. It says the identity name of the business network administrator. So as you know from previous videos, the admin comes kind of pre-packaged when we create the network or the runtime. So we'll just put that in. And then for the secret that we need to put in, that's admin pw. And then we need to specify the archive file up here, which is -a. So -a, and then we'll say perishable network.bna. And then finally, which is a little bit tricky, you have to specify a file that will be created and actually be imported as a business network card. So that is specified right here at the bottom, file, so -f, and we're going to call this network admin.card. So let's execute that command. Okay, so once we have successfully started the network or deployed it. Let's go ahead and check to see what's in this cards directory. So let's take the screen up if we can. Having a hard time here. Okay. So we'll come back down to cards in LS. We still have just this one peer admin card. But if we, well, let's not do that yet. But now we must actually import it. So we'll say composer card. Well, first let's go ahead and get some help with this. We can do, with the composer card, we can do create, delete, export, import, and list. So for right now, we're going to say composer card list. And you can see at this point, there's just one card in our business network. But if we go composer card import, and then give it the file called network_admin.card, which is what we just created, if you remember. We typed that into our network start command, gave it the file name network_admin.card. So let's run that. It says command succeeded, and so now let's say composer card list again, and you can see that we have this user ID of admin for the perishable network, and the card name is admin@perishable_network. You can also see if we list the cards, we now have a new card in our network. So let's go ahead and close that out. And you can see how this is a lot more convenient and useful than the last version of Composer, or at least in my opinion. I really do like this. So let's continue. We need to ping the network to make sure that everything is working correctly. So we'll specify the card or just -C, and you can see we'll just go ahead and copy and paste this one right here to make sure our admin is working correctly. And you can see that the connection to the network was successfully tested with as the participant admin, which was the default participant that we were actually supplied with when we created the network. So 4.5 videos later, we're finally at the point where we can start to actually do something with Hyperledger Composer and actually like deploy it and make an application out of it. Now, unfortunately, with the new release, the devs have not yet released the Yeoman or Yo generator to create the Angular application that was previously in the other tutorial. So we're still waiting on that, but I'll try to take you through some of the considerations you would make when making an application. The first one is let's go ahead into our terminal and print out all of the Docker containers we have running right now. So if you recall, previously I ran this command and all we had were these containers right here. These containers were spun up as part of the startfabric.sh script in the fabric tools directory. But now we have this container up here, which is, it's something called devpeer0.org1, yada yada yada. So this is actually what we just deployed to the network. We deployed a new peer, which we called admin, to the network, and it's running in a Docker container, which essentially could be deployed, it could be pushed up to Docker Hub and hosted on AWS or Azure. So you can see how this is kind of going, and now we can start a REST server, which is a really cool feature that we have. This is created with a loopback, and what we're going to say the business network card that we're going to use is admin@perishable_network, I believe. We're not going to use namespaces because that just it adds a lot of extra clutter to the REST API. As far as I know, it doesn't actually change the functionality. For now, we're not going to use Passport. We'll get into that in a second. We'll enable event publication over WebSockets, which we are going to be talking about really soon. Do we want to have TLS security? Not for now. It's generating it. Now you can see that the REST server is listening on our local host port 3000. So if we go over to localhost 3000, you can now see that we have a REST server. Now, one thing I'll mention, you see this access token up here. As far as I'm concerned, this is just something that I had running in the background. This will be getting into the authentication part, so don't worry about that for now. But what you can see here is we've got all of our different participants and assets and transactions that we can perform basic REST functions on, or CRUD functions on. So, you know, say we go over to the setup demo and we click post, and we're going to try that out. You can see we got a 200 response code, so it was successful. And as if you remember correctly from the Composer Playground demo, what we just did was create a bunch of participants and assets. So if we go up to grower now, this is just an example, and we say get grower, and we click try it out, we're going to successfully get this farmer@email.com that our setup demo transaction created. At this point, you should be able to see kind of how all of these participants in the network, all the nodes in the network, can interact with the network itself. So with this totally application agnostic RESTful API, you know, any application, or for that matter, any machine or person can interact with our network now. Obviously, we have to deploy it up on a, Azure container or something like that. But at this point, you can just kind of imagine the possibilities. So let me just quickly take you through a little bit. We already submitted the setup demo, but I will just take you through the parameters that we are looking at. So for each of these, we have all of the available HTTP methods. This one's a transaction, so you don't have many, but for a grower, you have all of them. But anyways, we'll go back to the setup demo, and you can see if we click on post, we have an example value, and this is provided for us for all of them. So what we do here is we could take that and paste that into data and alter, the transaction ID, setup demo 2, something like that, and then click try it out. And when we do that, what we'll get is a response body, which is essentially what we typed in here. And then it'll also give us the command line command that we could use to do the same exact thing, or the API endpoint that we can send requests to. And then it also gives us a response code. You can see that I tried to do this again, but we had already invoked the setup demo, and you can't have duplicates of participants in the network. So, but anyways, you can play around with this and see the possibilities. But that's the basic setup of this RESTful API. Obviously, an application is not going to be physically coming to this, on localhost 3000, but it gets the point across. Two other ways that we can interact with this network is through events and queries. And a lot of people have asked about the querying language, so I wanted to cover that in this video. But first, let's talk about events. When a transaction happens, whether it be a shipment received transaction, a setup demo transaction, or a temperature reading transaction, we have the ability to emit an event which can actually be subscribed to by various applications. So if we come over to our CTO modeling file, what we can do is actually create a new event. We'll just call this shipment has arrived. And within that event, we're going to point towards a particular shipment, and that's just about it. So our shipment has arrived, and the way that we tie that into the business network is actually in the logic.js smart contract file. So we're over in the logic.js file, and what we need to do is find the function that represents our shipment received, and that's the first one here. So what we're going to do is come down to the bottom of it, where we are returning all of our promises and updating the assets and participants in our network. And we need to come down to the shipment registry part of things, because right here we're getting the shipment registry. This variable right here represents the entire registry, and from there we can create our event. So what we're going to do is say create new event. And how we're going to do that is we're going to say a shipment notification equals get factory. This is part of the JavaScript API, and we'll call a new event. We're going to pass in our namespace, so org.acme.shipping.perishable. And then for the second parameter, we need to give it the name of our event. So we called that shipment has arrived. And that command, so we've created the new event. Now what we need to do is update the information within that event. So we'll say our shipment notification dot shipment, because if you remember, our event shipment has arrived contains a shipment as part of the data. So we're going to say shipment notification, which represents that event, dot shipment equals shipment. And this is a little confusing, but if you remember, in our variable up here, we have identified the shipment that we're actually talking about. So we can use this variable and assign that to our event. Finally, we need to actually emit the event. So we'll say emit shipment notification. And there you go. Every time this transaction is called or happens, it's going to emit this event, and anyone in the network who is subscribed to it can see that event. Now, you might be wondering, how exactly would I subscribe to this event? Well, this is a little bit out of the scope of this video, as I'm not going to be actually building out a full application, but there is a method or an API call that we can use that says, I'm just going to write it down here for the sake of time. So we can say business network connection dot on and say event, and then specify the event and give it a function to run. So you can say the event is a class of org.acme.shipping.perishable dot shipment has arrived. And then we can say the shipment on that is whatever that is, and then what we can do is console.log the event or something like that. So this is once we've connected to the business network. You can see that in the JavaScript API on your own, but there's a method called on that we can subscribe to different events for and do whatever we want with them. So that pretty much covers the events. Now let's move on to the queries. Here I've created a new file called queries.qw or qry. And this file is going to define all the different queries that we can run on our network. And what queries are useful for is they can be published to the REST API, which we'll see in a minute, and different participants in the network can run different queries on the network. They're also useful because you can actually tie them into some of the smart contracts. And for example, say you had a shipment that had a large quantity of items. What you could do is filter with a query for all of the shipments that has over a certain quantity of items on them, and then do something with those shipments in a transaction in your network. So these are very useful, and I'm going to quickly show you how to write one. So in the queries file, what we're going to do is say query and then give this query a name. So we'll say the name for this is get grower contracts. So what this query is going to do, we'll say in the description, and we'll say allow grower to find what contracts they are on. Whether or not this is useful, that's up to you to tell, but it gets the point across. So now we're going to say the statement, and this is where we get into the classic like SQL query language specifications. You can use pretty much anything that you could with SQL, whether it be select, where, order by, group by, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to keep it fairly simple, but we're going to just say select org.acme.shipping.perishable.contract. So we've selected all of the contracts. And we're going to select all the contracts where the grower on the contract equals a user input. So this is a special syntax here. If you preface a arbitrary variable with an underscore and then a $sign, this can actually be user input in the RESTful API. So we've written the query, that's all we need to do. And now what we have to do is regenerate our business network because we've updated quite a lot in this network. So we'll go ahead and save everything that we've updated. And I think that's it. And then we'll come over to the command line. You can see I've left the RESTful server going up here. But now we're going to create our BNA file again, or actually recreate it. So we'll say the source type is a directory, the source name is the current directory, and we'll say the name of it is going to go into the dist directory, and we'll call it perishable network.bna. Okay, so that succeeded. Now we have to update our deployed network. So the way we do that is, well, let's first remind ourselves, composer card list. We have these card names. So we'll say composer network update, and we'll give it the perishable network.bna that we just created. And actually, before we do this, we need to go into the dist folder. So composer network update, perishable network.bna. And then the card that we're going to give it is admin at perishable network. And that should be able to update our network for us, hopefully. So that succeeded. We'll just quickly ping the network to make sure it's still working okay. Okay, so it's working. Now hopefully, if everything goes as planned, we can come over to the localhost 3000 again, port 3000. And what we should be able to see is a query somewhere. Actually, what we need to do is close off the REST server. Go ahead and just bring it back. We need to restart the REST server. So we're going to say admin at perishable network for the card to use. We're not using namespaces. No on the authentication. Yes, all defaults. Now let's come over and see if it has updated. And you can see that we now have a query field, which we can see our new query that we wrote. So let's go ahead and try that out. You can see here in the example value, this is what we're going to get as a response. So we'll have a list of different contract objects. But first, let's take a look at what I've created off camera. So I went up here to the contract and created a bunch of different contracts. So I'm going to get all of the contracts. And you can see here in this field, there's a bunch of different contracts on here. What I want to point out is the different growers on the contracts. So I also created a new set of growers. So if we go to grower, get grower, and try that out, we get a couple different growers. And the one I want to point out is sue@email.com and then farmer@email.com, because those are the two that I put on the contracts. And if we come back up here to the contracts, you can see that reflected. So each contract is just con 001, 002, 3, and so on. And the first three of them have farmer@email.com listed as the grower on them. And then the last three, contract 4, 5, and 6, have sue@email.com. So what our query should do is return us contract 4, 5, and 6. So let's see if it does. We'll put in the parameter field. This is our user input that I had talked about. We need to put in a resource called org.acme.shipping.perishable.grower, and then hashtag sue@email.com. Try that out. And you can see we have contract 4, 5, and 6 showing up under this query request. This REST server is pretty cool, and there's a lot of applications for it. But one thing that you might have noticed is the fact that this whole permissioning and identities, you're not seeing that on here. Anyone that has access to this server can do whatever they want with it. So you really have two options when it comes to this. The first option is to put the REST server behind an API management gateway, such as Azure or AWS. Now that's the one way that you could keep it secure. Now if you're not doing that though, you have to enable the multiple user mode for the REST server. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. But what you have to understand is this REST server is actually storing all of the identities that we would create in multiple user mode in local storage. So that's actually only a good thing if the clients trust the REST server that they're querying and interacting with, because all their private keys and wallets are on that local storage in the browser. So it's strongly recommended if you are not running an API management gateway and you've just exposed this REST server to the public, that you trust the node that's running it. So that's, I'm not going to get too far into that because that's a lot more on the architecture design, but I just wanted to consider it here. So in order to run the Composer REST server in multiple user mode, we actually have to come up with an OAuth method. So what we need to do is come over to our GitHub account, and I got to this page by logging in, clicking on Settings, and then clicking on Developer Settings at the bottom. And you can see that I have no OAuth applications at this moment. So I'm going to register a new application. We're going to call it Composer. The homepage URL that we're going to give it is http localhost 3000. This is a perishable network tutorial. And the authorized callback is auth/github/callback. So we'll go ahead and register that application. Okay, so now that we've registered this, we don't have to do much more. All we have to do is grab these two, the client ID and the client secret. So let's grab the client ID first and come back over to our README. So what we want to do is put that right here under client ID. Okay, so this is going to be in the README. You'll have this to reference back to, but you'll replace that with the ID you just got, and then you'll replace the client secret with the secret that you just created. So we copy that and put the client secret in there. So once we have that, we can copy this whole thing, and what I will do is bring it over to a remove white space thing. So I've copied it into this. I'm going to remove all the white space. We need to add a space right there. And then we can actually assign this environment variable called Composer Providers. So now if we echo Composer Providers, this is what we get. And at this point, we can start up our REST server with OAuth authorization or authentication. So we'll say Composer REST server, and this time we're going to actually ask for some help because I don't remember all the possible flags. But actually, before we do this, we need to install globally on our system Passport GitHub, because this is not going to work otherwise. And now we should be able to use the Composer REST server, and we'll specify the card as admin at perishable network. We want the namespaces to be never. We want the port to be 3000. We want to enable authentication. We want to enable multi-user mode. WebSockets is automatically true. We don't want any TLS. So I think that should be it. And it's up at localhost 3000. It looks like the loopback failed to render the contract for some reason. I'm not going to worry about that at this point, but let's go ahead and look at it now. The first thing that you need to do is type localhost 3000/auth/GitHub. And authorize your GitHub account. And then it's going to take you back to the server. It looks like we still have the contract, so I'm not really sure what skipping unknown type was for. But now, at this point, we've seen this access token across the top of the REST server the whole time, but now it actually applies. And if you click show, you can get this specific user's access token. You can see we additionally have a wallet part of our REST server now. So if we click on wallet, we can say get wallet, and we'll try that out. We get a 200 response code, and you can see that there's nothing there. There's no identities in the wallet. So in order to get something in the wallet, because right now, as far as I'm concerned, you cannot even do anything on this network. If you were to create a new grower, let's see if you can even get a grower. Yeah, so any command that we run right now is not going to work because we don't actually have an identity running on this server right now. So in order to get an identity, we need to import it. We can do that from the fabric. So let's go ahead and import wallet import. And we can actually choose a file here. And I believe we will be using the network admin card. This was created when we first deployed the network. And the name of the business network card is admin at perishable network. And we get a 204 response code, which means that it worked. And now we should be able to get a wallet. Oh, this was the last response. Okay, so now we have admin at perishable network, and this is the default wallet identity. So the way that this would work in real life, assuming that you go the route of exposing your REST server to the public maybe, is someone would come on to your hosted REST server, and they would authenticate with GitHub, and then they would look at all of the possible things that they can do with it, and say they try to, make a post request to create a new participant in the network. And obviously, when you first pull up the REST server, there's nothing in the wallet, so you can't actually do that. And so what would happen is that participant, if they're actually a valid participant, would have a wallet or a card file that was sent to them from maybe an administrator in the network, and they would upload that card, and then they'd be able to use the network. So that's just like a simulated description of how this might work. For the sake of time, since this tutorial has already gotten pretty long, I'm going to cut it off here. I will say that there are several things that I did not cover that I would have liked to in this tutorial, such as deploying the REST server and creating a skeleton Angular application or a Node.js application. So those are definitely topics for future videos. And also, I was not able to show those partially because with the new release of Composer, there are still a lot of issues that are being worked out and bugs that are being found. And so it's tough to keep up with that just coming off of the release so recently. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, learned a lot from it. I covered as much as I could, but check back later and hopefully I will be able to upload another tutorial on a more full-scale application development. Thanks.